that this Lord of all has a plan for all as well, and he has a plan for you today. My plan for today is to continue in our series on the book of Hebrews, and we're going to be spending our time at Hebrews chapter 7 today. If you'd like to get out a Bible and follow along, that's where we're going to be spending most of our time this morning, Hebrews chapter 7. You know, when I was a kid, I was obsessed with this movie called Space Jam. You know, the one with the Looney Tunes and Michael Jordan, a basketball movie. I loved this movie. Had it on VHS, would put it into the VCR and watch it all the time. And not just that, whenever I would play with the little Nerf basketball goal at the end of my hallway, I would pretend that I was in Space Jam. And whenever I would go to an 8-year-old's birthday party and I wanted to sound cool, I would talk with them about Space Jam. And I even had the soundtrack on a CD, and I would demand that my mom played it as we drove to my YMCA basketball games, you know, to get pumped up for the game. Because I was pretty sure that that's what Michael Jordan did when his mom dropped him off at the arena in a white Chrysler minivan. And I wanted to be like Mike in that way too. So needless to say, Space Jam played a really big role in my early childhood. And believe it or not, I hope Space Jam can actually help us today to understand what is probably the strangest chapter in the entire book of Hebrews, one of the stranger chapters in the entire New Testament. It's the one about Melchizedek. Do you remember Melchizedek? In Hebrews chapter 7, the writer of Hebrews makes this elaborate comparison between Jesus and this mysterious figure from the Old Testament named Melchizedek. And if you're sitting at home today and you're wondering, who in the world is this Melchizedek that you speak of? Well, we're going to get to that in just a second. But suffice it to say for now, Melchizedek is the book of Hebrews' way of talking about hope. And that's what I want us to talk about this morning as well. Last week, we also were spending our time talking about hope. You may recall we looked at Hebrews chapter 6, and we talked about things like where hope comes from, who hope is for, and what hope can do for us if we really take hold of it in our lives. And in fact, if we go back to our key verse from last week, there we read about taking hold of hope, which is for us a steadfast anchor for the soul. And that passage ends by saying we have this hope because Jesus, a forerunner for us, became a high priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. So even in our passage from last week, already Hebrews is starting to move us toward this particular figure from the Old Testament. And what I want to say to us this morning is that that is really good news. But in order to understand that good news, we need to know a little bit about mysterious Mel. So I want to spend some time with that today. And against all odds, that's where I think that Space Jam is going to help. So first we're going to talk about Space Jam, and then we're going to talk about what Hebrews calls a better hope. So in the movie Space Jam, which if you haven't seen it before, is a movie where the Looney Tunes, Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, Elmer Fudd, all of the Looney Tunes find themselves in big trouble. Reason being, these giant aliens come from outer space, and like giant aliens are known to do, they challenge the Looney Tunes to a basketball game, and if the Looney Tunes lose this basketball game, they're going to take them back with them into outer space to be part of this terrible circus. And I know that as the words come out of my mouth, this all sounds quite ridiculous, but bear with me. The point is, the Looney Tunes are in big trouble. And it's the kind of trouble that they cannot fix for themselves. If left to themselves, there is no way in the world that they are going to beat these giant aliens in a game of basketball. Like, even if their lives depend on it, which they do. Like it or not, they are pretty much helpless in this scenario. They're not going to win on their own. They need someone who is not like them to intervene for them. They need a hero to swoop in. And that, of course, is where the great Michael Jordan comes into the story. The Looney Tunes, in desperate need of help, call upon someone who is not like they are. They call upon someone who is not one of their kind to become one of them, to join their team and help them to save their lives. And that, of course, spoiler alert, is what Michael Jordan turns out to do. In fact, there are these two very important moments in the movie. I'm not sure you could call anything in this movie poignant or touching, but this is as close as you get. Michael Jordan has this moment where, up to this point, he's just been kind of an outside helper, but at one moment in the story, he takes the problem on himself, and he says, if we lose this game, you don't take the Looney Tunes to outer space, you take me instead. He puts himself in the place of the problem. And then he ultimately puts that problem on his shoulders and carries the team to this improbable victory, literally carries their opponents all the way to the win. And thus you have the plot of a very strange and silly movie called Space Jam. Nothing could seem more trivial than that. Except maybe I hope that this story here might help us to understand something very serious about our lives of faith. And it all has to do with that strange chapter in Hebrews 7. So in Hebrews chapter 7, we find this peculiar comparison going on between Jesus and this fellow named Melchizedek. And the reason that this chapter is making this strange comparison might be hard for us to recognize. In fact, even this Old Testament figure, Melchizedek, is one that the Old Testament has very little to say about. And yet here in Hebrews 7, he suddenly becomes this huge, important character for understanding Jesus. And the things we learn about him are kind of strange. Let's just read a little bit from Hebrews 7, verses 1 through 9 will give us a bit of a picture of this. Listen to the things we learn about Melchizedek here and see if we can make sense of this. Verse 1, for this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. And to him Abraham apportioned a 10th part of everything. He, Melchizedek, is first, by translation of his name, King of Righteousness. And then he is also the King of Salem, that is, the King of Peace. He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning nor of days nor end of life. But resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever. See how great this man, to whom Abraham the patriarch gave a 10th of his spoils. And those descendants of Levi who received the priestly office have a commandment in the law to take tithes from the people, that is, from their brothers, though they are also descended from Abraham. But this man, who does not have his descent from them, received tithes from Abraham and blessed him, who had the promises. And then skipping down to verse 9, one might even say that Levi himself, who received the tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his ancestor when Melchizedek met him. Okay, now I'm sure every last detail of that just made perfect sense right when I read it, right? Naturally, you may be wondering, what is this passage talking about? Who is this Melchizedek figure that Hebrews is talking about? And what, if anything, does all of that have to do with Jesus? To me, those are pretty fair questions to be asking because the details in this argument are kind of curious. On the one hand, we do meet a fellow named Melchizedek in the Old Testament. We meet him in Genesis chapter 14. These are the 3 verses in Genesis that talk about Melchizedek. So on the one hand, we do have something about him in the Old Testament. But on the other hand, when you read these verses from Genesis, we get nothing like the things that are said in verse 3 of Hebrews 7. Things like that Melchizedek was without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, resembling the Son of God, he continues to be a priest forever. These details from Hebrews are new to us. We do not get this from Genesis. The closest thing we may get to this is actually from the only other time Melchizedek shows up in the Old Testament. That's in Psalm 110, where the writer of the psalm describes a figure who the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. But even then, that doesn't give us just a whole lot to work with, does it? And that's it. That's all the Old Testament has to say about Melchizedek. It's just these 4 verses in total. But then we get to Hebrews chapter 7, and he's this major figure, and he's this important comparison point to Jesus. So what is really going on here? And why does it matter to us? What is Hebrews trying to say to us in all of this? Well, believe it or not, I think it's trying to say something similar to that story from the beginning. That when humans like you and me faced our biggest problem, we needed a hero of a whole new kind. Someone who was not like us to save the day. In fact, what we needed was someone who was not like us to become like us and carry our burden on his shoulders. And that, I think, is why Hebrews chapter 7 says the things it says and why it makes this comparison that it gives to us about Jesus and Melchizedek. So let me elaborate. First of all, our story from earlier began this way, with a lot of trouble. And we might say also that the story that Hebrews tells begins that way too. The story that Hebrews is telling is the story of people like us in big trouble. And this is not a silly story. This is the story of our ongoing struggle with sin and with death, like the age-old story and problem of our lives of faith. Throughout the story that the Bible tells, this has been our constant struggle, and that is even true for God's people, Israel, in the Old Testament. In fact, what Israel learns, and Hebrews will remind us of, is that when it comes to this big problem, the problem of sin and death, this is a problem that we cannot fix ourselves. So take, for example, the priests of Israel. God instructed the people of Israel that they ought to have priests on their behalf amongst their people. And we talked a few weeks ago about how the priests actually play a really important role. They're set apart to help the people. They are meant to be these mediators who are helping with that very problem, the problem of sin and death. But the issue is that the priests, maybe they can help with the problem, but they cannot solve the problem. They cannot fix the problem once and for all. They can help as best they can. But as Hebrews chapter 7, verse 11 is going to say, if perfection had been attainable through the priests of old, if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, what further need would there have been for another priest to arise? You see, the problem is we all, including the priests of old, we all have succumbed to sin. And even the priests of Israel, if we go back to Hebrews 5, even those priests, they were chosen among men. They were people like us. They were beset with weakness, just like us. They had to make sacrifices on behalf of their own sins because they, just like us, sinned just as we do. In other words, these priests, even when they were at their best, could not really ever overcome the big problem. the problem of sin and death. They could help with it. They did help with it, but their help was ultimately limited because they, like us, were people like us. So we have this problem. Perfection cannot be attained by ourselves. We have this problem, and we ourselves cannot fix it. So what people needed, says Hebrews, was a priest of a whole new kind. What people needed was someone who was not like us in all those ways that we fall short of the problem. And that's where Melchizedek comes in. Not that he is the answer, but that he is the way of talking about the answer. He is the comparison point for the answer, which of course is Jesus Christ. So if you look at some of the things that Hebrews says about Melchizedek, think of these not just as being about Melchizedek. Think of who else they might point to. So in those verses that started the chapter, we're told that Melchizedek was a priest and a king. Who does that sound like? And we're told that he is not of this world like we are. Who does that sound like? We're told that he is not temporary but eternal. Who does that sound like? We're told that he resembles the Son of God. Now, if you look at these details for Melchizedek and you're just trying to compare them to Genesis, they might sound kind of out of left field. But the point is not to tell us about Melchizedek. The point is to show us how Jesus is that priest and helper we need who can do what we could never do. The point is that Jesus is the one who is not like us because he is both king and priest, because he is eternal in origin, because he is the Son of God. The point, verse 16, is that Jesus is not just another priest, not just another person who happened to be a priest because they were born into a certain family. No, Jesus is the kind of priest who is a helper by the power of an indestructible life. Is this making sense? These peculiar details about mysterious Melchizedek, they're actually all serving a pretty simple purpose. They are telling us that humanity was in such trouble we couldn't help ourselves. But God came through for us and gave us a priest and helper from heaven. Someone who is a hero of a whole new kind. Someone who didn't come from where we came from. Someone who is a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. And through him, a better hope is introduced through which we may draw near to God. Because if Jesus were just another priest and nothing more, if he were just another priest of Levi, then how could he really provide us the help, the rescue that we need? But because he is something more, something not like us, something eternal, something indestructible, something royal, because of that, we have this better hope, a hope of true deliverance from that long-standing problem that we have had with sin and death. I think that's the beauty of how Jesus is like Melchizedek. That's kind of the point. But it doesn't even stop there. What makes Christ truly special and truly able to give us that better hope is not just that he's different than us. It is the fact that our hero, who is different than us, became one of us, joining our team, becoming like us in humanity. Though a king of heaven, though the Son of God, the way that this eternal helper helps us was by becoming like his brothers in every respect, says Hebrews 2, by taking on our weakness, being tempted like we're tempted, suffering like we suffer, sticking out his neck risking his life in solidarity with our problem, choosing even to carry our problem, what we could not carry, on his own shoulders. The problem of sin and death, our enemy, he carried on his shoulders when he went to the cross. The improbable victory is because the one who was not like us became like us so that he could rescue us once and for all. That's the beauty of it. And both of these things are so essential. Had he only been one of us, like the priests of Levi, his help would have been just as limited. But had he never become one of us, and I really mean become one of us, then what would he have saved? Not humanity, unless he was humanity, like flesh and blood, like us in every way. So this is the better hope of Jesus. Praise God that he was not like us. Where would we be without that? Praise God that he became like us, because that is where we find a better hope. The one who was not like us became one of us to deliver us. And that is the good news of mysterious Melchizedek. That is the good news of the cross. Maybe this is something that you might need to hear this morning. As strange as the passage may be, the point that it brings to our lives and our hearts is actually a really important one. Maybe the fact that Jesus, though he did not have to, and though he was not like us in our sin, maybe the fact that Jesus chose anyway to become like us, join our team and carry our problem and defeat sin and death for us, maybe that challenges you to make a change in your life. Maybe it's time for you, because of the way that Jesus became one of us, to become one like him, which is what we do when we surrender our lives in baptism in his name, sharing in his death and resurrection. We become like the one who became like us. We share in who he is, just as he shared in what we are. And maybe that's a hope you need to take hold of in your life. Maybe others of us, we are inspired by what we see and what Jesus has done to help us. Jesus gave his life for others. And maybe as we think about that, what it challenges us to do is live for others, just as we saw our Savior doing for us. However you may be challenged by this message, we will sing this song of encouragement to reflect on the better hope we have in Jesus.